Hi everyone, I'm Emilio, and this video is part of a series that I helped produce for Overthink on the philosophies of histories and memory through several conversations that we had with experts in the field. Today we're interviewing Dr. Myriam J. Chancy, who is a novelist, literary scholar, critic, and the Hartley Burr Alexander Chair of the Humanities at Scripps College. Her most recent novel, What Storm What Thunder, received an American Book Award and appeared on multiple of Best of the Year lists of 2021, including on the National Public Radio, of the New York Public Library, and of the Boston Globe. Her scholarly work spans over 3 decades of continued influence and field-defining monographs on Caribbean women's literature and editorial positions on various journals across the field, including as editor-in-chief of the journal Meridians. She currently has 3 upcoming book projects, including a collection of essays called Harvesting Haiti, coming out this October with University of Texas Press. In this conversation, we talked with her about her latest academic book, Autochthonomies, Transnationalism, Testimony, and Transmission in the African Diaspora. We especially focus on the concepts she develops around personal and cultural identity and the way they are written through classic texts of the African diaspora. The book is a challenging but very rewarding read. And although much of the critical work is explained in this conversation, we also recommend that you check out the companion video to this one that we developed as a video essay explaining some more of her ideas and concepts. That video is linked in the description, so with that said, let's dive into the conversation. Professor Chancy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about your latest academic monograph, Autochthonomies, which describes a critical reading process to approaching works created by individuals in the African diaspora. It cuts across academic disciplines and fields of study, and it foregrounds transnational affinities within the diaspora. So I think let's get right into the text. Emilio?
Yeah. So before we get into the substance and the context of the text, we want to ask you a bit about its context. We wanted to know what this text means to you. How does it fit within the work that you've done and who you are writing it for?
Yeah, so I think in some ways it's a departure from my previous work. So the 3 books before that were all on Caribbean women's literature, Afro-Caribbean, Anglo-Caribbean, Haitian. And so I think of those first 3 books as a trilogy that allows scholars to think about the Caribbean in more pliable ways, having to do with gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, the diaspora. And then I actually had a break partly when I was doing the editorial work with Meridians, and then I actually left academia for a little bit. And I was living partly in Europe, in California, and I was reading widely because I didn't have an academic position. I was just reading what I wanted to read. And it suddenly dawned on me that cultural producers, what I call cultural producers of African descent, were engaged in a completely different conversation than what was taking place and has been taking place in the United States around what we would call race studies or Black studies. And so I really wanted to get into then what is this conversation that's happening across cinema, literature, plays by people who come from the continent and are part of the diaspora, the African diaspora. And what I found was not what we were talking about, even to the present. So when I think about who was I writing it for, that's a hard question to answer because academic books take a long time to write, and then who your public might be changes over time. And this is a book that I worked through by doing talks. So I would be invited to do talks, keynotes. And what I found over time giving those talks is that often audiences were not prepared for my end result. And so the book is less what I thought I was going to write, which was taking a deep dive into what the nature of these conversations across the diaspora were like, and really re-educating different audiences, mostly in the literary field, but also in cultural studies, post-colonial theory, race studies, on the possibilities of shifting their ways of reading. So it's both for the people producing the works and who are not being heard and read adequately, and those who think they're engaging the works well, who I'm hoping to shift, the way they work with the production.
So you mentioned that there's a different conversation going on in the text than what's going on maybe in academic contexts.
Right.
And one way we were thinking about this in your text is you identify many moments of like misreading.
Yes.
And so I was wondering, you introduce two new theoretical concepts, autochthonomy and Lakou consciousness, to try to identify and address this misreading. So if you could talk a little bit about what is that fundamental misreading that's going on in academic context, and why was it necessary to introduce these new concepts to address it?
Yeah. And I'm not entirely saying that all readings that hinge on the colonial relationship or the moment of enslavement and its aftermaths are incorrect. What I'm saying is that they're not the only lens through which to read African diasporic works, but it appears to be the only lens through which most works today are being read. And I think that's problematic. I'm not denying that these are historical moments that have had a huge impact both on the continent and beyond it, but that many works, especially when people of African descent are speaking to one another, do not engage these as primary foci. They just don't. And so one of my key texts is Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And that text is primarily read as a text, I think it was published in 1937, looking at Black women's emancipation in the Deep South. A Black woman trying to make her way both in white society, but also through patriarchal structures within African American society, and what that might look like, how she self-emancipates. And that's not an incorrect reading. That is what it does. But once you realize that Zora Neale Hurston actually wrote the entire novel in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and you start looking for what was her conversation with Haitians and Haitian cultural producers at that time. She was studying the folklore, she was studying the Vodou. She also was aware of what was happening in the historical contemporary moment. You start seeing that it marks the novel heavily. And so I started reading the novel as a kind of memoir of her passage through Haiti. And all of a sudden, things that many critics could not unpack, thought were inventions. So for example, some of the phrases that are found in Their Eyes Were Watching God, some linguists and Black cultural critics could not find in Black Southern lexicons. They just thought she had invented them. But actually, they come out of Haitian Creole. Sometimes she played with their meaning, but you could actually trace the original phrase in proverbs in Haitian Creole. And so to me, to not know that she was engaging with Haitian culture and that she found through Haitian culture a way to create that emancipatory voice in Their Eyes Were Watching God would be a misreading. But when I was giving these talks, it was really interesting, on Hurston in particular, Black cultural critics who had been wanting to know what those sources were really happy to find out that that's what was happening. Whereas some critics, mostly white critics, just wanted the book to only be about the ways in which white supremacy impinged upon the Black community. So to me, those, the foreclosure of a possibility of another reading is what I was trying to get at. There was a lot of pushback. So I would give these talks and people would say, the refrain was always, what about white supremacy? And I would always come back and say, so the issue is not that white supremacy doesn't exist. The issue is, why is it that Black voices can only be heard if they are speaking about white supremacy? Then the next question becomes, what are you not hearing? Because you're only looking for this dialogic. You're only looking for actually a recentering of whiteness in the Black text. What if something else is going on? And what can that inform us, like the larger culture, about what possibilities there are for thinking about ourselves as non-raced, as cultured or acculturated, as being in conversation with one another, if we see the conversation between Black cultural producers as productive and telling us something new or something else than what we thought it was telling us.
Awesome. So your work focuses a lot on misreadings in academic scholarship, in philosophy and literary criticism, but there's also a moment that sort of excited us while reading in the conclusion, because you do mention students, and how you notice in your students a similar habit of misreading, where students will only engage with the text to the extent, as you were saying, that it relates to white domination, slavery, colonialism. We were wondering, why is that not a skill that you learn, or that some scholars learn going from a student to a professional scholar?
I think this is a problem that is endemic to the educational system, in particular in the United States, from high school through undergrad and maybe beyond. And some of it has to do with the shift in what we used to call the culture wars from the 1980s. And obviously we're in another moment of cultural wars now, where wherever you place yourself on the spectrum, I think the current cultural wars are over these polarities in terms of race between Black and white. And so it doesn't allow for a more nuanced conversation. So if in the 80s we were opening up the possibilities for multiple kinds of conversations, hearing people who are Indigenous, African American, so forth, into queer studies, I think today there's been a kind of foreclosure and a kind of dampening down, to a sort of very narrow avenue in which we can hear certain voices, or we allow them to have presence in academic circles. With freshmen or incoming students, even when they're well-meaning, in their approach to literature or text, is that they have been taught to read only for a reflection of themselves in the text. Because, and this is the way I hear them frame this, so first year, second year students, that they don't want to appropriate the text, so that to see themselves in, let's say they're a white student, see themselves in an Asian, representation, or an African American representation, or Caribbean representation, would be to appropriate the text, which is not what appropriation is, but that's what they've been taught. So what they look for is representations of themselves in the text, because then they feel they'll be safe. If I look for something that I can understand, I won't make any errors. The problem is that actually it leads to misreading the text. So one of my examples, which I think might be in that conclusion, is when I used to teach a text by Chimamanda Adichie called Half a Yellow Sun, where there is only one main white character, and he's kind of minor. But I would teach this up through graduate students, and even my graduate students would only identify with a one white male character who was minor. And so I would be thinking, how can this is like a 500-page book, like this is a really long book about the Biafran War, so civil war within Nigeria, and somehow my students are, like not wanting to read about the other characters or engage with them, and I thought this was very strange. And at least in one case, I did ask a student why this was happening, and they said, because I don't want to appropriate experiences not my own. But then I said, well, I can't remember this. The character's name is Richard, and I think he's British. I'm not sure if he's British or American. But the student wasn't this identity either. So I was kind of like, well, why is it, if you're not English or you're not European, why is it more comfortable, to adopt this character than the others? And so that discomfort is something we really have to break through. And so this is why the text begins with the idea of how do we peel away these layers. So usually when I write an academic book, I have a set of concepts, and maybe I borrow from other theories and I apply them to the text, and I sort of demonstrate what is happening across a series of texts through several chapters. And in this book, when I started really getting down to writing the book, bringing together the talks into different chapters, I realized I couldn't do that. I had to actually teach my reader to unread and then learn how to read again. And so I call it a process book. And at the beginning, I talk about a book I also think it's from the 80s, Stanley Fish, is there a text in this class, which was a big book at the time, reader response theory, which talked about how we produce interpretation and how the ways in which we interpret text is a conversation with the text, but also with the communities that produce the text. And one of the reasons I was reaching back to Fish is because I think this is something that has fallen out of our practice as literary students or scholars, which is to really think about the communities that the books come out of and to engage with those communities, whether we're from them or not. So where is the author positioning themselves? Where are they thinking through, their work? And in the case of Hurston that I talked before, then what is that conversation about and how is it impacting the text? Rather than only think about the setting of the novel, but where, she has been in community, the author has been in community, and what's being deployed in the text. So I want to kind of reach back to your last question about the two concepts that I deploy in this book, which are Autochthonomies and Lakou consciousness, because Lakou consciousness really comes out of a folk tradition. It is a Haitian term, the Lakou, but you also find it in the Anglophone Caribbean, which is the yard. And the origin of the yard and the Lakou go back to, villages in Africa, where villages were organized around these, sort of rounded formations, and everything took place in that, that middle space. It was protective, but it was also a space in which people, produced their culture and engaged in their culture. And in the Caribbean, especially in places like Trinidad, it became where people communed to create, musical forms, new musical forms. In Haiti, it's where Vodou might produce their, rituals. And I use this idea of the Lakou because it reaches back to the continent, but then I argue that it's now virtual. We don't need that physical formation to commune and to exchange those retentions that are part of the communities of a diaspora, even when, especially in the American context, people are told that there was a break with slavery. My argument is that there are some breaks, but they are not complete, and that we see in the recirculation of memoried form, ritual, and the ways in which people express themselves in their arts, a regeneration of those forms. And so this is where the Lakou consciousness comes from as a concept, and that we could, and I do argue in the conclusion that, I'm Haitian, so I'm using a Haitian term, but it could be replaced with other modalities that other people are familiar with that are consonant with their traditions, their communities, and that they see reflected and repeated, across the diaspora. And then the other term, Autochthonomies, it's kind of both critical, academic, and everyday, right? In the sense that autochtone is a term that's used mostly in the Caribbean and French African traditions to talk about indigenous formations. And I married that with autonomy because in Black studies and race studies and post-colonial studies, we use terms like emancipation and freedom, and they're always tied back to slavery and enslavement. And I wanted to free the term a free subjectivity from this idea that it is only tethered to slavery and freedom from European colonization. So autochthonomies is a way to think about indigeneity in African formation. And of course, it's a very vexed terminology, and I talk about that in the introduction, first chapter, in terms of how indigeneity has been tethered to legal terms internationally, which actually remove the African continent as almost as a whole, because there are indigenous groups that are recognized internationally and by the UN, but they have to be nomadic. They have to be they don't have sovereignty is the term I was looking for, but they don't have sovereignty. And so it basically means that most of the African continent cannot be considered indigenous. And I'm trying to recapture that through the term autochtone, which we do use in African studies and African Caribbean studies. So autochthonomies allows me to think through the emancipation of the subject without thinking about that emancipation as emancipation from slavery or from European colonization.
I'm interested in the way you talk about Lakou consciousness as being both widely applicable and something that originates specifically from the Haitian context,
Yeah.
and that from your personal context, like, and in a way carries that forward. And I wonder if you think about it as something that can be carried further beyond Haiti, and like if you see ways that other people are doing similar sort of work beyond the African diaspora, in indigenous studies, in like mestizo studies, like all of these sort of fields that are contiguous, but
Sure.
each very different.
Yeah, I mean, I would think in terms of what I see happening in indigenous studies and mestizo studies is a kind of, recapturing of a decolonial, impetus, right? I don't use the word decolonial as much in my work, but I think what I see or understand as decolonial studies in these other disciplines is very similar to what I'm doing in the sense of, centering the indigenous experience and also having a conversation in terms of syncretism with colonial forms, but trying to disambiguate them from the colonial. So I think that is very similar. But I do think, and maybe this comes from my feminist, training, as a theoretician, I do think it's important to position one's work with an understanding of one's positionality. And so I do begin with Haiti, and this is why I deployed Lakou consciousness, because I'm aware that my formation is very different from, I think, American-based scholars. So I'm based in the United States, but since I was born in Haiti, raised partly there, then in Canada, came to the US as an adult, I don't have the same formation in terms of how to understand being of African descent as people who were born and raised in the United States. And so the Haitian particularity is actually very important. And I think more people who are engaged in African diaspora studies now, especially post-2010, so post the earthquake, becoming more aware of the imbrication of American history, American aid constructs with Haitian history, has started to understand the ways Haiti has really influenced what has happened in this country, even through the Civil War and through Juneteenth and all of these moments in American history. And I'm also aware, having moved through Black spaces, but I read them very differently. Like I remember going to Trinidad in Cuba, which is a small town in Cuba, and being able to read the walls. So seeing a mural on the wall that depicted an ocean, and then being told it's Yemaya, but reading Erzuli. I could just walk through this little town and read everything on the walls, literally without having a conversation with anyone, because I realized that Santeria and Vodou were in conversation. I've had people, read my work who are from elsewhere, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and say, oh, we have this, we have that, we have that. I see myself in this work. And what are they connecting to? They're connecting to the African retention that is similar to what is happening in their own country, even if they themselves are mixed, with, they're part Spanish, they're part indigenous, they're part something else. But the African connection is actually very similar. And then they are able to read their reality through another reality. So what I'm suggesting is that in the same way that I've read different texts through Haiti, or have seen Haitian cultural producers, for example, Raoul Peck, the filmmaker, read Rwanda with Rwandans, right, alongside Rwandans as an ally, in witnessing the aftermath of the genocide, then I think that others can walk alongside with me, or might reverse, they might tell me, well, in Brazil, it's candomblé, or it's this, and, tell me what their reality is. And maybe Lakou becomes replaced with a different term, but it is still a conversation that is anchored in this Africanity, for want of a better word, but that isn't, worked through a reality that impinges upon that, that retention. I think that's the difference. That's what produces maybe a richness in what we could understand. And what that does in a larger context, which is the larger argument of the book, is that whoever then comes to these texts, if they read Autochthonomies, if they understand Lakou consciousness, they don't have to be of African descent or from any of these cultures. they can then go and read any text by somebody of African descent from the United States or elsewhere and be aware that the people who are producing these works are not walking through what they might perceive as a white world, because then the world becomes a different space, has a different valence, a different, different layers of reality, and it might move them away from this idea of what is white and what is black, actually, because one of the things I also do in this book is not use the word black very much, because I do think it's still, even, we capitalize it and we talk about blackness as a cultural formation, it has a tendency in the classroom and elsewhere to be reduced to color and to be reduced to the black-white polarity. And so I try to use African, descent, African cultural formation to really bring us back to culture. And so I would hope that then anyone who reads my text and then the text that I talk about might start thinking more about culture and how they are tied to culture than thinking in terms of color and polarity. And then that might, in the classroom space, bring us back to this idea, or take us away from this idea that I've heard my students talk about, which is appropriation. Because if you're culturally engaged, you're no longer appropriating. You are in a conversation with a text that may or may not be like you, but that you either are learning from, which is the point of education, or are being startled by or embraced by, depending on your own position.
I want to talk about how this transnational, transcultural solidarity happens, and specifically in one text that you analyze, which is The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, which is quite an old text from the 19th century.
Yeah.
So it's the first text by a Jamaican woman of color to be published in the United Kingdom, and you discuss about how she never names herself as Jamaican. She says the city where she's born, which is in what is now Jamaica, but she doesn't claim that identity. And she never names herself as black. She never names herself as these things that we retroactively might push onto her and might read her through. And I would like to ask you about like how does this articulation happens, but how does it inform us, like, by being like an older foundational text as opposed to being like a novel from this year, Why is it important to find its historical roots, and how does it come back to the present in your readings?
So that's a huge question you've asked me, but it's a great question. I mean, I think I would begin by saying, related to the other questions about what is happening in the classroom, is that I think one of the problems that we have now, and I'm not sure where it came from, to be honest. And maybe it comes from wanting to, engage our students. And so we do read the latest novels, and we do need to keep up to date, But part of what happens is that we are not teaching what I would call the genealogy of literatures. That is, and I'm not saying that I want to return to the surveys, of American literature and or even create a new canon. But the thing is that we do need to know what came before. And the reason I came back to Seacole was because I was engaging with travel literature, right? And one of the reasons I did that is because in English, in British and American literature, when we talk about the post-colonial, we often do engage with travel literature as being the moment at which colonial literature, so produced by white writers, begins to speak of the other. So it very much is a moment where we can explore the post-colonial relationship, with quote unquote those who were colonized. But we don't often talk about the people who themselves traveled, even when they were, in servitude. And Seacole is one of the few texts produced in this period by a woman who was free. She was a free person of color. She had a lot of money at a certain point. She was one of the wealthiest women in the UK. But she was also denied a number of different opportunities because she was a visible woman of color. So one of the ways people talk about her is that she was the Black Florence Nightingale, and actually denied a place in Florence Nightingale's group where she asked to work with Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War and was refused. And so one of the reasons I went back to her is this is a chapter where I'm also looking at Fanon and Fanon's explorations of Maya Capecia, who he himself misrepresented in his work. And the interesting conversation that takes place between Fanon and his misreading of Capecia is that he misreads a novel by Capecia as a memoir while using memoir devices in his theory, right, which is in Black Skins, White Mass. So he's himself using the strategies of a memoirist, and yet the memoir that he's misreading is not a memoir, it's a novel, which is based, ironically, on a memoir of the ex-husband of the woman who wrote the novel. So it's a messy book. But as I intuited that this was happening, in the ways that Fanon was trying to both dismiss Capecia and then utilize some of what he perceived as being successful in her work, because she did quite well in the French context with her work, that this had already been happening in Caribbean women's literature previous to Fanon adopting this model. So he was adopting this in the 40s, and then, as you mentioned, Seacole is producing her text in the 19th century. And so I wanted to show that there was a tradition in Caribbean women's literature of utilizing this first-person narrative voice, which we then find is talked about in feminist theory in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s as being a mode of disarticulating identity in order to advance an identity particular to women's conditions. And then I'm arguing that it was also taking place in the tradition of Caribbean women's literature. And what is, I think, quite inventive in particular in Seacole's case is all of the ways in which she uses rhetorical devices that we wouldn't think of as being used in this time period, especially by a woman of color writer. And she uses them in ways that are artful, but also very much politicized. And so so as I was saying, she can't say she's Jamaican because Jamaica doesn't exist at this time, but she also is both saying that she is and is not things at the same time. So at once saying, I am the product of empire and I am not. I'm both the product of somebody who is of African descent and who uses alternative forms of medicinal healing. And I am also, just as good as Florence Nightingale, So this way of maneuvering through people trying to impose upon her, an identity that is already foreclosed, but is only this or that. She's already saying from the beginning of her text, I can be all of these things at the same time, and yet still claim, this identity. And so this is why I, put in parentheses the dis, both in disarticulation and disidentification, because I'm saying that these cultural workers are doing both. They're disidentifying and disarticulating in order to articulate and identify.
I want to return, or maybe build off this section of talking about Capecia and Seacole, and put it in the context of the development of the broader reading practice, like the pedagogical aspect of your book that we were talking about earlier. Right. Because you mentioned the chapters are in the order that they are in for a reason.
Yes. Because usually you can now disarticulate most academic books, right, and only read like the chapter you want for your own study. But this book is very intended to be a kind of progressive unlearning, relearning, learning process. Yeah.
Exactly. So I was wondering if you could maybe put in context what is the skill or the aspect of that reading practice that your reading of Seacole in that chapter was intended to help teach or help show or demand of the reader?
Yeah.
And then how does that fit in like the larger development through the chapters or through the book of the broader reading practice?
If I remember correctly, I begin by providing the reader with the two broad terms that I've created, the neologisms for this study. So autochthonomy and Lakou consciousness, and explaining why these are pivotal and why I want them to, by the end of a study, to be able to deploy those terms with confidence and with a sense of what they encompass, right? So you might have no idea when you begin, and you might think, why is she talking about indigeneity and autonomy and the yard? Okay, maybe it's a little folksy, And then what I do is I move through examples of ways in which certain texts have asked us, or certain cultural producers, so Adrian Piper is a good example, have asked us to really rethink our stasis around race. Like we know it when we see it. And Piper says, no, you don't. You look at her, you don't know. You think she's white, but she's actually black. Maybe she's a number of things. And I think through some concepts that other theoreticians have worked through, which have to do with racial formation, racial animus, how race is embodied and how it is performed. So the beginning of the text is really about performances of race and how we might be pushed to think about how we perform race and how we might want to stop performing race. So then I think I moved through some readings of disability, and again, disability, this in the parentheses, and ability. But the point of that chapter is to show how these authors, writers, and also the case itself demonstrates that the performance of race and its legal encoding has distorted our understanding of who we could be in the world and who we actually are. And once you understand that, I think it's impossible to read anything that involves what we think of as race identities in ways that are only black and white. I think it shows you that there is something else going on. And so then I move from that to disarticulation and disidentification to talk about how we might think about, so a 19th century text and then a 20th century text, or mid-20th century texts, who are really grappling with both the colonial and decolonial moments, and with this construction of race as it is being imposed and cemented, right? Even as people are trying to move out from those colonial formations. And so my sense then is that a reader would then feel like or understand that in the same way that Stuart Hall asked us to think about articulation, right? How things are, or assemblages, how things are brought together in a variety of ways to create new ethnicities, new forms, that we could also then engage in a disarticulation from those cemented racial formations that prevent us from seeing the big picture, right? So the disidentification and the disarticulation is occupying a third space, which is, what people would say in post-colonial theory and also in some aspects of queer theory. A third space which is both within and without, but also belongs centrally to another reality, which I don't want to call another reality, but I think Mignolo and others have called otherwise, but it's something else, but perhaps we can make it central. And from there, I move to the final chapter, which is the Harlem Renaissance chapter, where there really was a conversation in the 1930s between mobile Harlem Renaissance writers, who went to other places that were African and Afro-Caribbean, for example, and had full exchanges, even though those exchanges were also premised on their privilege as Americans. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, I wanna ask you about how one can move back towards writing, not only reading but writing with this interpretive practice. And I'm thinking specifically about history and of your latest book, What Storm, What Thunder, which narrates events of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, but not from a perspective that is necessarily the mediatic or the large event perspective, but from a more ordinary embodied or lived perspective. I just want to ask, like, how do we return to like telling and making history once we have this new interpretive practice? And how do we engage with a real world that frankly doesn't have this practice, right? Like, how does that conversation happen, and how are you able to bridge and being able to write and narrate and move beyond one's own like experience?
So I was smiling because I was thinking maybe I have an advantage because I'm Haitian, and that particular book was on Haiti and Haitian realities. Just recently, someone was asking in a different context, how do Caribbean writers engage with Caribbean people who don't have access to, academic environments and libraries and the training that some of us have had, And my response was that, well, Caribbean people don't need me, because people in the Caribbean are already engaged in Lakou consciousness. They're already performing it. They're already deploying the art, the culture. So something like What Storm, What Thunder, I had to be responsible. I couldn't sit in my tower and just write whatever I wanted. That book came out of many years of working with people on the ground post-earthquake in terms of their everyday realities and understanding what the needs were and understanding it from an intellectual perspective as well as an activist perspective. How do I lend my knowledge, my networks to people who need them, but who know better than I do what is needed on the ground, and really listening to what people are saying. So that novel was informed first by that, the reality on the ground, but it also meant that I needed to check a lot of things. I needed to make sure my facts were correct, both geographically, but also in terms of what actually happened. If I'm telling you that a character went through a cigar cut, amputation, I need to know what that means and what that looked like and check the medical records and these kinds of things. So I think in terms of being a writer, the engagement has to be an engagement that is responsible, is attuned to what is happening in local space. It does mean engaging as a researcher, right? Like doing the work of understanding what is happening on different levels in different disciplines. And it also means, it's a very strange thing to be a writer, because on the one hand, you need to believe in what you're working on and that your words matter. So there's some level of ego involved. But on the other hand, to engage in Lakou consciousness, you have to quiet your ego. You have to decide that what it is that you want to represent well is more important than your own artistic aims, if I can put it that way. So you're still producing art, and maybe this is kind of hackneyed, but you're producing, I'm thinking of a philosophical, Sautrien art engagé, like engaged art. You're still, in some ways, politicizing the work, and the politics there is to be consonant, conscious of where you want to situate the work. So if I want to situate the work in the Lakou, which is a crossroads, which is a meeting ground of different cultures and memory and history, then I need to know what is coming together in that Lakou in order to reflect it accurately. Now, how I embellish it, in terms of the structure of the novel or the language that I'm using, that's the art part, but I can't let that take over, what it is that I'm trying to convey about the society, about what's happening in the space itself. So another way to answer your question is that the problem, as I see it, is that academia or criticism has not, in some ways, caught up with the history that's already unfolding all around us, whether we're talking about indigenous people, right here in the Americas or in the Caribbean or in Latin America, or people of African descent who have been displaced, or other cultures, who are coexisting with what we perceive of as the dominant culture. But I'm not even sure the dominant culture exists. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. It exists, but it is a political, economic, legal formation, which I'm not sure exists in the kinds of ways we can think of as indigenous African and other kinds of cultures are existing in simultaneous time, impinged upon by that, larger dominant culture and maybe denied its existence, but it's still there. So I think academia is lagging behind, what is being produced in all of these areas. What's interesting is that the people producing in these areas are not necessarily academics or interested in what's happening in academia. So maybe I'm just an interloper within academia, and hopefully a book like this can help others who want to intervene in the sort of ways in which academia produces and reproduces itself, and maybe produce, more responsible and more responsive ways of reading, as well as producing the works that we do.
Yeah, thank you. And from personal experience, I think I speak for both of us when we say that it is a firmly academic read. It is.
Yeah, this was a little bit,
Yeah.
high theory for me.
It's very academic, and yet it speaks to us as students, as interlopers in a way, who are interested in learning these things and who struggle, I think, otherwise to think about these things.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to read some of Autochthonomies. It is my last academic work. I won't be producing more. I mean, I have a book of essays that's coming out, but it's my last gasp.
You're done?
Yeah, I think so. It's up to people like yourselves to, take up the mantle and see what else can be done. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm giving up. I mean, it's a lot of work to produce these kinds of texts, but also I feel like, my feeling when I was producing it, and even it did come out right before the pandemic, so it didn't get as much attention as perhaps it could have. But I have a feeling that we're not there yet. People are not yet interested in having this other conversation, Although we were talking earlier about Achille Mbembe's new work, I do think that conversation is happening elsewhere. It's not really happening yet, particularly in the United States. But I do think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the cultural war that we're in the middle of right now. And it leaves very little space or air for a more expansive view of what can happen. And I'm personally more invested now in writing literature, fiction. So that's where you'll be seeing more of me.
Professor Chancy, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation.